Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Graber. I'm at Canary, the Director of Threat Research here. So today we're going to be talking about process injection. So why would we choose process injection over, say, any other arbitrary attack technique? Well, earlier this year, when Canary released our threat detection report, we found that within customer environments, process injection in 2019 was among the most prevalent attack techniques used. So we figured what better opportunity for us, Canary, and also our amazing partners to come in and do a deep dive talking about the variations of process injection, how it works, like under the hood. We're going to get in the weeds a little bit, and then to discuss various detection strategies on how we tend to think about process injection and how we could go about thinking about building robust detections for them. So with that, let's dive right in. Just a reminder, this is being recorded. So not only the video, but the chat log as well. And there should be some links that will be posted with some additional supplementary material that you can follow up on. So that will all be included in the recording as well. So again, my name is Matt Graber. I'm the Director of Threat Research at Canary. And today we're joined by our awesome partners here. So Erika, why don't you take it away?
Sure. My name is Erika Nornberg. I'm a senior threat researcher at VMware Carbon Black and do mostly malware analysis and reverse engineering.
Hi, I'm Adam Pennington. I lead MITRE attack at the MITRE Corporation.
I'm David Kaplan. I'm a principal security researcher on the Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection team.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Super excited to deep dive into this stuff with you. All right, so if you're not familiar with Canary, just real brief, our main line of business is we provide managed detection and response. Additionally, on the side, we release open source tooling, including Atomic Red Team is a really popular open source tool that, that we've released and maintained with the help of the broader community. And we also offer educational opportunities like this. So what is process injection? Adam, help me out here.
Yes, this is the sort of textbook definition of process injection straight out of the attack website that's up on the screen. But at the end of the day, process injection is a way of running arbitrary code in another process's memory space. So it's running code basically as another process. There's a number of things it may give you access to, whether it's things that are in that process's memory itself, resources that have been allowed to be used by that process. And if that process has elevated privileges, maybe operate with the privileges of the process itself. It can be a really good way to evade defenses because to both security products and defenders, that process is going to look like it's something legitimate. Next slide. So we talked about a little bit of sort of why we're talking about this today, and that it's a really popular technique by adversaries. But why is it so popular? So it's a really effective way to be able to execute pretty much arbitrary code inside another process's memory space. Because it looks like that other process, it can be a very good way to evade both defenders and defensive controls that are focused around specific tools. It's most commonly used in a couple different ways, one of which is to elevate privileges, so acting in another process's context in order to leverage its administrative or other privileges. The other context is to steal secrets that are in the memory of that other process. So to be able to get in and do things like steal browser cookies that are native to a particular application. It's something that is built into the operating system. It's taking advantage of features that are baked into Windows and other operating systems that can't entirely be turned off. We'll talk about some ways to mitigate them later on, but it's working on fundamental operating system components. There's also a lot of different ways to do it. I'm excited going to show you 11 different sub-techniques that represent it in the upcoming version of attack. So if you're familiar with ATT&CK and the word sub-technique is something new to you, ATT&CK has recently been working on refactoring the way we describe techniques. We used to have some very, very broad techniques and narrow techniques, and we've done some work to try to even things out within the framework. And so something like process injection, which is a fairly broad technique, has been broken out into 11 different sub-techniques, which are more specific techniques or ways of actually doing process injection. We're going to talk about a couple specific sub-techniques today. And I should say this is from the beta version of ATT&CK that is public now and will be coming out on July 8th. Going to start off by talking about portable executable injection and using Ramnit as an example of using it, followed by thread local storage with Ursnif and process hollowing with Trickbot. Going to end with talking about a couple ways that this can be done in non-Windows contexts, getting into ptrace system calls, proc memory, and VDSO hijacking.
I know Adam and his team at MITRE have put in a tremendous amount of work into sub-techniques, and I'm deeply appreciative of it because it's always been kind of a tricky question previously where, like, if someone approached me and asked, hey, what is your detection coverage for process injection? It's kind of a hard question to answer because process injection, as you can see, is a very broad topic. And now that we have sub-techniques, each sub-technique is going to have its own independent detection strategy. So now that sub-techniques are available, this really helps me as a researcher and a detection engineer to better scope the logic of our detectors so that we can more confidently claim that we have good or not good coverage for a sub-technique versus the broader overarching technique. So thanks for all the work y'all have put into that. So the first thing that we're going to start talking about is portable executable, or PE injection. So this is a super common technique, and the use case that we'll discuss is how Ramnit, a prevalent banking Trojan, uses it. And then we'll take it back up a level and talk about generic detection strategies around PE injection in general. Okay, so what is PE injection? Broadly speaking, PE injection involves writing position-independent code. And when I refer to position-independent code, I'm referring to either shell code or a self-loading DLL, like also referred to as a reflectively loaded DLL, one that has like a little position-independent loader stub that can load itself in memory. So the ability to inject that into another process and then invoking it by spawning a new thread. There's some common APIs that are available for use to achieve this form of injection. The most prevalent ones in kernel 32 are open process. So this would be used to obtain a handle to the target process that you want to inject into. Virtual alloc EX, which would be used to allocate memory in that target process. Write process memory to write the contents of the position independent code into the memory region that you just allocated, and then spawn the thread using create remote thread. Now, there are many API variations that can be used. There are many APIs within NTDLL that could be used as an alternative, which we'll see is the case with Ramnit. Now, attackers that choose to go above and beyond and be a little more stealthy in the interest of, say, evading inline hooking mechanisms, is they could go right to the syscall level and avoid that API hooking if that's something that they were worried about. So why would an attacker choose PE injection over any of the other injection sub-techniques? To me, like if I was to put my attacker hat on, I would say that this technique offers an attacker like particular flexibility in that it facilitates direct injection into their target. Now this assumes that you have position independent code that's going to be executing. And to me, the APIs that are used are relatively not complex and they're pretty stable. So assuming your shellcode or DLL payload is itself stable and say doesn't have like self-modifying code, which if you're allocating just read and execute memory, then you could run into some issues there. But the APIs themselves are pretty stable. So who out there and what out there is using this form of injection? I'll speak to Ramnit. It's been using this for a while. Cobalt Strike uses this injection technique as well. It's one of a handful of injection techniques that it supports, as well as invoke reflective P injection in the PowerSploit PowerShell module makes use of this. But there are many other utilities and tools and actors out there who consider this to be one of those tried and true techniques. So how does Ramnit use P injection? So Ramnit is a prevalent banking Trojan. There's a lot of great articles out there if you want to learn more about this. It's a pretty full-featured Trojan. So it does P injection, but for what purpose? In the case of Ramnit, it injects a traditional DLL into a browser process, Chrome or Internet Explorer. The APIs that it chooses to use are the anti-DLL based APIs, so just one layer lower than kernel 32. And how they choose to allocate virtual memory in the target browser process is by requesting a page execute read write allocation, which can be suspicious in and of its own right, because it's generally not super common in processes that allocation would be made, especially from the context of a remote process. Now, the injected DLL is not actually built to be a reflective or self-loading DLL. It's just a traditional DLL that is written to the browser process memory. So there still needs to be another loader stub that is injected into it. So there's two components, the DLL and the PE loader stub, which is position independent, which is spawned by creating a thread in that target process. Now, they have also in the past used invoke reflective P injection to achieve a similar goal.
You had a question come in on the chat on what's the goal of injecting into browsers here? Is that what lets them steal credentials?
Yeah, so that would absolutely be a great assumption there. I would not consider myself to be a subject matter expert on the capabilities of Ramnit, so I'm just left to speculate. And yes, if I were to inject into a browser process, I can think of two plausible reasons for that. One, to steal credential material or like session or cookie data. The other might be if I wanted to use the browser as a proxy for C2 communication, since it's expected that network connections will be made from browser processes. So those are the two things that come to mind.
Yeah, and also, Matt, I can't speak for Ramnit specifically off the top of my head, but in the case of Ursnif, there are definitely variants that inject into Chrome and other browsers specifically to steal bank credentials in particular for banking sites.
Right on. Cool, thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. So as a detection engineer, how might I go about thinking through how we could possibly detect P injection at work? So I usually start by enumerating a list of assumptions that need to be made about P injection. So what are these assumptions? These are the things I try to think through of what are the absolute minimum set of requirements that an attacker has imposed upon them in order to successfully carry out the attack technique. So in the case of P injection, and based upon how MITRE has documented the scope of that technique, the assumptions that I would make would be that, well, I didn't list it here, but that this would be done from the context of a user mode process, and that the acquisition of a handle to a target process needs to be made. Right, so there are APIs that are leveraged to do that. and there are specific accesses that need to be requested of the target process. The next is that executable code is written to the memory space of another process. So all executables that are running obviously have executable code, but there may be some unique properties or some heuristics that could be built in processes that otherwise have high reputation that where you wouldn't expect certain runtime attributes to occur, like from the context of another process, an executable page being allocated. Like that may not be a common thing. Another would be that injected code is executed by spawning a thread. So hypothetically, if there was a data source that could capture thread creation, we'd have some context there. Some hypotheses. So these are the questions that I would love through the course of my detection engineering research to answer. For example, having reversed enough samples that do PE injection, I see that SE-debug privilege is requested in the majority of the cases that I've seen. So is that a potential heuristic that we could key in on? Another hypothesis raised is to what extent is code or is memory allocated with executable page permissions at runtime, like after the process has been loaded. So I know this to be the case with like .NET applications, browser processes, since there's like jitting going on. But to what extent is that expected in other processes? Another question would be, will injected code always be injected into a memory page that is not backed by a file? So these are questions that I would love to have more confident answers to through the course of developing detection logic. So how might we go about detecting PE injection? So here are some heuristics that could possibly be considered, assuming we had the relevant telemetry to capture this. So the first would be that a handle to a process is obtained, requesting at a bare minimum process create thread, VM operation, meaning memory operations are going to be performed on the target process, and VM write, memory writes will occur to that target process. Another heuristic could be that RWX, or read, write, execute code, is allocated in a process that doesn't normally perform dynamic code generation. It's not super common, but you know, if an attacker can abuse APIs, then legitimate developers are going to abuse those same APIs, and they may be naive to the proper way of doing things. So I certainly would expect some false positives to come about using this this heuristic, but that's also okay. Another possible heuristic would be that a PE header would be written to memory that isn't backed by a file on disk. Now, this is an assumption, of course, because an attacker, since they're already writing their own position-independent code, there's no hard requirement that they must write a PE header into the memory space of another process. But lots of malware does. Another could be that the process that performed the injection has particularly low organizational or global reputation. Also, suspicious token privilege adjustment, or in the case where SE-debug privilege is requested, that, for example, in conjunction with like low reputation, starting to paint a better, more confident picture of something that might be suspicious. Lastly, a very specific detection analytic that's available out of the box in Windows 10 is there's a SACL that is now applied to the LSASS process at startup. So whenever any process does get a handle to LSASS, so if malware was to, say, attempt to dump credentials from that process, there would be an event log entry for that. So that's, yeah. Was there a question?
Yes, we had a detection question come in while you were speaking on if there was any way to detect process injection with sysmon. And I believe the answer is current versions of sysmon have events for several of these distinctive actions, but you may be able to answer that better than me.
Absolutely, yes. Now you'll have to forgive me for not memorizing all of the event IDs in Sysmon. I know we probably have some like amazing experts in the audience already, but I'll give them my best shot. There is a process access event in Sysmon. Gonna go with event ID 8.
It's 10.
It's 10. Oh, so close. So that would give you the access that was requested to obtain the handle to the target process. So that's where you would be able to go back and resolve the minimum set of access that was requested for process injection, being create thread, VM operation, and VM write. There's an event ID for thread creation, is there not?
Yeah, it's event ID 8.
Okay, there we go. I was close. Cool. Yeah, so you have that, and you have process creation events as well. So I would say those 3 event IDs are going to be your best bet for getting as close as possible to detecting P injection using Sysmon. Adam, did you have anything to add to that?
Oh, not really. I'm just able to cheat on the event IDs because I don't have the slides up full screen.
Nice, nice. Cool. Well, with that, so that's all I had for P injection for now. We still have lots of rabbit holes to go down. So why don't we transition into the next injection technique? And Erika, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Thanks. So we're going to talk about thread local storage callbacks, which are another injection technique. And we're going to use Ursnif as an example of one of the more recent examples of malware that actually employs this technique. So thread local storage callback injection is basically involves the redirection of execution from a standard process PE entry point, the portable executable entry point, and it redirects before the execution gets to that PE entry point. It's actually going to redirect to a thread that the malware author has, or the malware has copied their malicious code into. So basically just kind of redirecting execution before the standard execution of the executable. Although it's kind of uncommon, it can be a successful anti-analysis technique because typically analysis is going to start at the entry point of the PE, and this malware is going to get executed before that ever is reached. And like I said before, we're going to look at Ursnif as a common or a current example of malware that employs this technique. So what is Ursnif? It's another prevalent banking Trojan. It's also been named GOSI. Basically data stealing Trojan in general. It's often spread via malicious Office documents, and it employs similar injection techniques to the other ones that we're going to discuss on the webinar and what Matt's already discussed. But in addition, it also manipulates this TLS, thread local storage directory structure, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So what does this technique look like? So first I'll talk about what is a TLS callback. Within the PE header itself, there is a TLS directory, which contains information about TLS data objects. And these thread local storage objects basically allow each thread to have their own static, and static is key here, their own static data area for custom variables or custom thread initialization routines that they want to employ. So the TLS directory itself contains this pointer, the address of callbacks pointer, that is a pointer to an array of callback functions. And you can see I've put the prototype down there of these functions at the bottom of the slide. And this is straight from Microsoft's documentation, so you can see that. But the sample of Ursnif in this case performs, like I said, the similar techniques to injection techniques. It creates a suspended explorer.exe or SVC host exe process in a suspended state, and then employs process hollowing in order to map the malicious code into the suspended process. But after it does that, it actually reads the process environment block, or the PEB structure, and then changes the protections on the PE header to allow write access. And then it writes a pointer to the entry point of this injected malicious code to that address of callbacks in the TLS directory, and then it'll resume the thread after that. So what this accomplishes is now, instead of execution continuing to the original entry point of the PE, it's instead going to resume to the entry point of the malicious code that has been added to that TLS callback array. So, yeah.
Yeah, so Erica, like if we were to speculate, and we all love playing this game of trying to get into the minds of the attacker, like what would you say would be the primary rationale for implementing TLS callback injection?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I said, it's not real common. I'm not really sure why, but it is fairly successful in terms of anti-analysis. Like I said, if I'm going in as a reverser or an analyst, or even some analysis platforms, the analysis is typically going to start at that entry point of the actual entry point of the original PE. And so this is going to get executed before. And actually, when I was first starting out reversing many years ago, I ran across a sample that was doing this, and I couldn't figure out why. I had my debug, I was debugging, and I couldn't figure out why the malware was already running before I even got to the entry point of the executable. And so I literally, being a complete newbie, decided to just start from the beginning of the executable and just step through everything. And that's how I ended up in this thing. And I was like, wow, what is this? But yeah, like even some of the reversers I've talked to, they're like, yeah, I really haven't seen this used much. So, but yeah, it definitely got me the first time.
Yeah, it reminds me of like when I was, to be clear, I still am a complete noob with everything.
Same.
When like I was first starting out in reversing, this just reminds me of like when I first learned that the main entry point function, like main or win main, is not the actual entry point of malware. And when I learned that like some malware authors will like inject code into the C runtime initialization that occurs prior to jumping to the main entry point. Yeah,
that's another fun lesson.
Yeah, we all get made fun of briefly, but then we learn and carry on. Okay, so sounds, like that seems reasonable, like anti-analysis. And like whenever I see anti-analysis measures, like I always think to myself, like anti-analysis buys the attacker time, right? And like this being a banking Trojan, like it's going to be all over VT. And so just like, it just creates that additional level of pain for the reverser. That makes sense.
Additionally, like with Ursnif, especially, a lot of samples that we'll come across won't execute like in a dynamic sandbox or something like that. They're not going to just execute and give you what you want off the bat. So
cool.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Thanks.
So we can talk about detection. Yeah. So we've already talked about some of the detection. Matt covered a lot of them, and even though it's difficult to detect malicious TLS callback usage in itself, detecting the actual injection is going to be similar to both of the other techniques that we're discussing. So I'm not going to go over those in general. In particular, David is going to be, Matt mentioned some things before. David additionally is going to talk about some detection of modification to like memory page protections. Like Matt said, page execute, read write, and VAD, or like the virtual address descriptor discrepancies. So David's going to go into more of that as well. But we talked about we talked about some of the APIs that were used by these techniques, and so you can obviously detect the usage of those, but the usage of any one of those by itself is not going to indicate malicious activity. And similarly, as David's going to talk about, you can't rely on the detection of suspended process creation either, because Windows processes are created in a suspended state. So in order to detect this malicious activity, you want to look at the process behavior in a broader context. So like Matt said, what's the reputation or trust level of the originating process in the environment or just globally? Is the observed behavior expected for that process? So for example, you wouldn't expect an Office document to spawn explorer.exe. So it's kind of more of a greater picture of this. You have to look at a combination of the behavioral events that are surrounding the initial process creation and have an understanding of what expected or anomalous behavior for a given process would look like. So David's going to discuss more detection and mitigation strategies as well. So I'll pass it over to him to discuss the other injection technique for Windows.
Thanks, Erika. So continuing on our theme of discussing a technique and taking a look at a case study, the next few slides we'll be speaking about process hollowing and looking at Trickbot and seeing how they employ it. So in terms of process hollowing, it's a process injection technique which in essence allows an attacker to carve out the executable section of a legitimate or a benign process and replace it with their own payload. And how this works simply is that an attacker would create a process, a suspended process, and prior to allowing that process to execute, they would unmap the original code, inject their code, and then resume their process. And the reason this is advantageous as a technique for an attacker, I feel, is twofold. Firstly, it allows the process that is hosting the malicious or attacker-controlled payload to pass superficial inspection of process metadata. So if you were to open this process up in, say, Process Explorer and take a look at superficial attributes such as command line or even the signing information and reputation, that should look benign if the hosting process is a process that is a legitimate benign process. So that's one aspect where we look at kind of the defense evasion advantage of using this technique. Another advantage is that since the payload or the attacker code is injected into the process prior to the initial thread execution, it can actually leverage the natural Windows loader or the loading process of any of how any process is created on Windows in order to load and initialize that code. So it doesn't suffer from the same limitations as other process injection techniques, such as perhaps P injection, and as Matt spoke about earlier, that generally might require position-independent code. Here, theoretically, a normally compiled PE could be loaded via the hollowing technique without too much trouble or massaging. So that's kind of a very big advantage, and we'll take a look at it when we look at the details. And in terms of who uses this technique, so it is very widely encountered. It's a technique that we hear about all of the time, both in terms of current threats and modern threats, but it's a technique that has existed for many years. It is fairly robust. So there are open source implementations such as RunPE, Trickbot, modern banking malware, which we'll speak about in a few moments, and then as far back as Stuxnet, which employed a variant of following in their kill chain. So one could consider this as a fairly robust technique, but there are a number of variants, and we'll speak about them now. So in terms of kind of modeling the variants of this technique, we can come up with a generalization where we've split up the technique into a number of steps. The first step, as we've mentioned, is that an attacker would need to create an instance of a process, but they'll create it in a suspended state. So Erika touched a bit about this, about the necessity of doing that for TLS, for thread local storage, type of vector redirections. The same requirement is over here because we require the replacement of the original code with the attacker payload prior to the initial thread execution. And as Erika also mentioned, what's interesting in terms of operating system internals, as far as the NT kernel is concerned, most of the process setup is governed by the create process API in kernel 32 in user mode, which will obviously go to the kernel and invoke various functionality in order to map the image section and to set up the process executive objects. But prior to returning to user mode, should create process not be called with the create process flag, then kernel 32 will automatically instruct NT to resume that process. So this flag simply means, hey, if I've called create process with create suspended, simply please don't go to the kernel and request a resumption of the process prior to returning to user mode. So this allows them to pause the execution and continue the attack. So the second part of the generalized technique is that the attackers need to discover the image base address of the legitimate executable code within the target process. This can be done in a number of ways. Two popular ways, firstly, to call NT-query system information with an undocumented information class that will return the PEB address. And the image base address is simply an offset from that PEB address. And another popular technique is to get thread context on the initial process thread. And in the RBX register of that thread context at this stage, that will point to the PEB address again. And again, the image base is simply an offset of that. So once the attacker has obtained the PEB address, the third step is to perform the hollowing itself, to, in essence, remove the original executable code from the target process. Can be done very simply by unmapping a view of the section. And we'll take a look at this more in depth when we speak about Trickbot. But once we've achieved step 3, we now have this kind of construct that has it's a process that has metadata that's set up that looks like a legitimate benign, perhaps benign process, but has no executable code. So we move on to step 4, and the attacker uses, this is where the attacker will inject their code into the process. Common ways of doing this, as with other process injection techniques and code injection techniques, for example, allocating read, write, execute memory and remotely writing to that location, or perhaps other techniques such as mapping a view of an existing section into that process. And generally, an attacker would want to allocate this memory at the same base address that has been located in step 2. The reason is that as part of the primary image setup that the kernel has done, that has been loaded into a certain base address. A view of the section of the original image is in that base address. So if an attacker can inject their code into the same base address, it just means that there are fewer fix-ups that they have to do. If they do, this isn't a hard requirement, because what they can do is simply allocate it a different address, but then they will have to fix up the PEB image base address pointer to point at their new code location. So that is kind of something they sometimes have to do, but generally they would like to obviously try and reuse the same base address. The last part here is to patch a thread vector such that they can get their new malicious entry point running when this process is resumed. So one of the popular methods, as Erika mentioned with Ursnif, is that they will use TLS. They will patch the vector over there to point at the entry point, such that when this process eventually gets going, that is executed. But the more common variant is simply to call set thread context and modify the RAX register, or the stored state of the RAX register with the malicious entry point address, such that when the kernel resumes this process after the setup, that is the address that will be executed. And finally, step 6 is just to instruct the kernel to execute the thread and resume the process.
David, just to be clear,
Sure.
some of the weaponization specific details that you're offering were specific to x64, right?
Yes, so that is a very good point. In the 4th stage, if we are speaking mostly about 32-bit code, in the 4th stage, when the attacker code has been mapped or copied into the target process, they often require a number of fix-ups to be done to that code, namely the relocations. So if it's non-position independent code, or any code that requires relocations, an attacker at that stage will have to manually, remotely in the target process or before they copy into the target process and fix up those relocations, which, without going into too much detail, requires a calculation between the delta of the expected base address for that image versus the actual base address where it was injected to in that process. x64 code requires less or fewer relocations generally.
Awesome. Thank you.
You had a question come in on this process. How is it determined which section to hollow in a file from step 3 here?
Generally, okay, so this is an interesting question, and it varies. Generally, it's the executable section. Now, there could theoretically be more than one executable section. Generally, it's the primary, what I term the primary executable section in the process, meaning probably likely the section that contains the primary code that will be executed in the primary image. It is a good question. Depending on the target process and variants of whether they even want to hollow out or simply inject, there are various different things that they can do. But generally, it's a primary image executable section.
Also, I've got some trivia for everyone. Does anyone know, so it's a man named Gary. Does anyone know his last name? The person who I believe originally developed this technique?
No, go for it, Matt.
So when I first heard of this, before I realized it was called process hollowing, has anyone heard of Nebit's shuttle? Yeah. But yeah,
no.
so I believe it was Gary Nebit who first referenced this technique like way back when. And someone could probably correct me. My history may be a little muddied, but yeah, that was my understanding of it. So good hacker trivia there.
Thanks. Learned something today. Okay, Trickbot, let's take a look at that. So very briefly, it's a banking Trojan, pretty sophisticated Trojan. It has multiple infection vectors, mail spam campaigns, spear phishing, malicious documents, exploitation of internal SMB vulnerabilities, the gamut. They're happy to use whatever they can to get on the network. They have a modularized design. They have modules for stealing Bitcoin wallets and credential theft, mail heists, and pretty much anything around that. So it's something that's extensible. And in fact, we see different modules being developed all the time as this progresses. And what's interesting for us as technical defenders, if you like, is that they use a number of very interesting techniques in their game chain. And the one obviously we're speaking about today is process hollowing. The most common variant used by Trickbot that a lot of people are familiar with is the use of SVC host as a container, as a hollowed process for their payload. The one I'm going to speak about today is a slightly different variant where they, interestingly, at least to me, use an instance of the malware context process as a way of unpacking or assisting in their unpacking flow. So they have their malware process or the malware code, and it performs some unpacking on a portable executable or DLL or some other code that they now need to execute. They're actually leverage process hollowing as a method of executing that code. And in this use case, it's less about defense evasion, but more about utilizing the Windows loader and in terms of getting the code set up and having the modules resolve in the correct manner. So let's dive into Trickbot and see how it fits our generalized model. So as we had in the general model, so just to say, firstly, this variant, to give credit, was discovered by Hort Gabriel of Albert Systems. He actually, prior to this webinar, went back to his IDB and did some reverse engineering for me, just to make sure that I gained the knowledge for him and understood exactly what Trickbot are doing. So a big thank you to him for spending the time and getting this set up for us. And let's dive in. So in terms of Trickbot, they create a suspended process, again, of their own process here. We're looking at the unpacking variant. So simply whatever context they're running in, they create another instance of that process, and they pass a create suspended flag in order to arrest execution. And the PEB, or the image-based discovery, is done by calling getThreadContext. This, as I mentioned before, in the RBX register, that will point to the PEB, and the image base will just be an offset of that register. The third step, in terms of the hollowing, once they have the base address, they pass it to NT-unmapped view of section. They unmap the entire section that is pointed to by that base address, such that the entire lot is currently unmapped and is hollowed out. And when they perform the injection, they actually use a very interesting technique. They don't allocate remote memory or write directly to the address space. What they do is they create a view, they create a section that describes their unpacked code. And this is created within the originator process, meaning within the malware process itself. They create a new section that describes the that describes the unpacked code that they wish to inject or to make resident within the hollowed process. And how they get that code to the hollowed process, they do it in an indirect fashion. What they do is they map a view of the section into the target process. So the Windows Memory Manager allows you, you could think of it kind of as like you have this memory that is allocated somewhere, and you can create another mapping to that memory such that you can have your own view into it if it's shared. And if you write to it, well, that's when copy on write will be invoked, and you'll get a copy of those pages that you wrote to. And this is, in fact, how images and modules are shared generically in Windows. It's not that every process will have their own instance of, say, NTDLL loaded into their process. They will share a mapping or a view of a singular instance of that. So they use this in the same fashion. Now, this is actually mapped in this sample that Hod looked at the very same image base address that they hollowed out, that they discovered in step 2. What they do, though, is that they rewrite this image base address into the PEB using NT-write virtual memory. And this is unnecessary here because they're just replacing the same with the same address. What I think they've done is that they've created a generic framework that, should they have needed to map to a different base address or have a different allocation address, then they would be able to fix that up and correctly write the image base address for that new allocation location. But in this instance that we looked at, it wasn't a necessary step. In terms of doing the thread vector patching, they simply set thread context, change RAX to point at the new entry point. And step 6 is the regular resumption of the thread. And at this stage, the kernel will resume the initial process thread, trigger the loader, and get the code running within the hollowed process. Okay, let's move on to detection. So in terms of detection, both Matt and Erika mentioned this idea of heuristic detections where we have this pattern. You can imagine those 6 steps, and we're trying to find variants and different techniques that can be used for each one of those steps. But generically, there's a flow that can be built here. And we could look for things like process creation and remote mapping or modifying sections, looking at thread context mapping or TLS changes, and then resumption. As Erika mentioned, using a signal of resuming thread on its own is a weak signal because all Windows processes are create suspended. It's just a matter of whether the kernel 32 will automatically resume it prior to returning to user mode. So that's the heuristics are able to be built. The other strategy is using memory inspection. Erika also touched on this. You can compare the PEB view of the loaded modules, or more specifically the primary image, and the view of the VAD. And if there's some discrepancy there, either by virtue of there being a difference in the backed image of the section or the base address itself, one might use that as a signal. And naturally, page protections, if there has been a remote allocation and the attackers have been sloppy and haven't cleaned up, there may be some resident page, read, write, execute page in the primary image that may be unusual. The other thing to mention, that we all mentioned, behavioral analytics with all these, in my opinion, are very important. Ultimately, process injection has many techniques. Each sub-technique has many variants, and we're going to discover more sub-techniques as the years progress. the greatest strategy we have, other than focusing on each technique itself, which we should do anyway as the best effort, but is to look at the relationships or the behavior of the process. Looking at anomalous parent-child relationships. For example, is it usual for a specific process to spawn SVC host in a simple case? We should also look at source to target mappings. So while there are browsers that may remotely inject and JIT code doing local injections, we might find patterns where is it usual for process A to perform these 6 steps that we now have built into process B, and trying to model that across your organization. And the last thing is that to focus on source processes as well. Not just to look at the target process like that SVC host and see what it does and see, hey, is SVC host behaving in an anomalous manner? That's going to be somewhat noisy and difficult to get right. But also to look at the source process to say, hey, what was the process that created SVC host? Was that suspicious? And if we contained that somehow, well, then we contained all child processes, including that SVC host from that node, if you like. So also just to go further up in the tree to try to see if we can build a kind of picture of something that might be anomalous. Some caveats to these things I've just mentioned. At scale, when building out heuristics for this remote thread management API usage, it's difficult to get a robust detection that works at scale. What we've noticed is that across many organizations, you have all sorts of weird and wonderful applications that are doing all sorts of injections in a legitimate fashion. If you are defending a single organization and you are well aware of the payloads running in that organization, you may have a better probability of success in building a robust heuristic detection. At scale for EDR vendors, this is a lot more challenging for us to do generically. Also behavioral analytics, important to model it properly such that it's not a point where you so focused on a specific type of behavior you're trying to match that in turn, that basically turns it into heuristic detection, as opposed to looking at something where we can model the behavior more generically. And with that, if there are no questions, I'll pass it on to Adam.
Yeah, so we've been picking a lot on Windows today. You know, the previous 3 techniques are all leveraging Windows APIs, but we wanted to spend a little bit of time, as I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, that this is a technique that works on multiple operating systems. So wanted to get into the 3 sub-techniques in an attack that were not Windows. Next slide. So starting with ptrace system calls. Ptrace is a system call that exists in a number of Unix and Linux variants. It's intended to be used to let one process debug another. So it is a system call that is at its root intended for remote process manipulation. With the right privileges, and it to some extent depends on the age of the kernel you're using, what's possible. An adversary can use the ptrace system call to suspend another running process, extract its registers, take a look at its instruction pointer, overwrite code at that location, and resume execution. Now, this is mitigation of ptrace can be relatively simple if, depending on sort of what trade-offs you're willing to take in your system, as ptrace can actually be turned off in Linux or using security enhanced Linux extensions. And so when we were getting ready for this webinar, we actually had this sub-technique. And if you take a look in the beta now, we had this marked as both Macintosh and Linux. And so we realized that the ptrace implementation in Mac is not really full-featured enough in current versions to be able to do this. And so we've updated that. It'll be fixed as it comes out. But I think it's something that sort of shows how attack can be a living knowledge base. Proc memory. So a proc file system is something that exists in a number of Unix variants, mainly in order to be able to look at information specific to a given process. So it's a virtual file system, and in Linux, it can provide a read-write window into the internals of both processes in memory. So it doesn't have the same ability to view state and be able to manipulate a running process as you have with something like ptrace, just memory access. It's a bit more complicated to do than ptrace system calls. But we can take a look at how memory is mapped into a given process. So we can do things like find the location of the stack through the proc pid maps file that exists within every proc directory for a given process. We can use that to find the stack, overwrite the stack return pointer, and use something like a series of route gadgets to take control. So this can be combined with something like hijack execution flow technique in order to add libraries supplying any missing gadgets that don't exist in the original function. And so proc defaults to, I believe, allowing a parent to access a given process's directory, but it can actually be restricted more than that with Linux settings. VDSO hijacking is a bit more exotic. So this is taking advantage of some functionality and stubs that have been put into the kernel for virtual dynamic shared objects. So basically a way of being able to run kernel system calls in a way that don't do an int80, don't go all the way into the kernel. Linux VDSO.so itself is a part of the Linux kernel. It appears to every process in a modern Linux as a shared library that's mapped into its memory. And it's providing access to system calls as well as those stubs that are doing just user space system calls. VDSO hijacking involves manipulating the register values inside of the VDSO memory space right ahead of a system call. So this is allowing an adversary to be able to change out the system call number, to be able to first open and then map in a new shared library, and then transfer control to the CodeNet new shared library. And so we only had these 3 Linux-only techniques in attack today, but I think Erika had some more knowledge on what things look like or have looked like in the past in the Macintosh space.
Yeah, so we talked about initially when we were preparing this webinar, we had a section for Mac, but as it turns out, for one, injection really just isn't used or seen in malware on the Mac platform. And there's a few reasons for that. The most prevalent being it's harder than just getting the user to click on something and type in their password, which is the most successful technique and very easy, and unfortunately very successful. But in addition to that, there have been several protections that Apple has put in place into the operating system beginning back in 10.11, I believe, El Capitan. They introduced SIP, which is System Integrity Protection. So that includes protection for certain parts of the system. So the system directory, user, bin, sbin, var, things like that. So basically this requires if any modification of protected system areas are only allowed by processes that are signed by Apple and that they have special entitlements. In addition to that, in 10.14.6, I believe, they introduced notarization of applications. So this is an additional step. Right now, in order to sign a process, you basically just need a developer ID, which is pretty easy to get. You basically pay $99 and you submit it. But now notarization adds an additional step of approval by Apple. It's not directly required yet. I believe in 10.15 they technically are requiring it, but another part of notarization is app runtime hardening, which is not enforced yet. Supposedly, presumably in 10.16, the next release, so we're in Catalina right now, which is 10.15. 10.16 supposedly will be requiring notarization with app hardening. And in addition to that, they're phasing out texts or kernel extensions. So basically any programs that require, right now that live in kernel space, so typical EDR or virus, antivirus products, anything that is currently using kernel extensions is going to have to switch to system extensions, which basically takes them out of the kernel and into user space, which is going to lock down that kernel space even further, which is going to make, I mean, even right now, it's fairly difficult to, or impossible to inject successfully into Apple or Apple actual system processes, but you can still inject into third-party apps that are not employing runtime hardening. But going forward, once runtime hardening is enforced and notarization, it's going to be a lot harder to perform injection. So I don't anticipate seeing this used in the future, even less so than it is now, just because it is so much easier to get access to the system in other means.
And there's a reason I don't have examples here for the for specific adversaries or tools using these techniques in Linux. It's across fairly scattered pieces of malware, and in some cases fairly old malware.
Okay, so I did want to briefly cover potential mitigations that could be considered to not broadly mitigate process injection, because there is no specific mitigation against all forms of process injection. Like, the ability to do this was built into the operating system, and there's legitimate purposes for doing it. But we can still attempt a best effort at mitigating some of these issues. So I did want to mention more the broader strategic mitigations, specifically if we're talking about process injection, then that assumes that the attacker already has arbitrary unsigned code execution on the system. So for those who may be interested in preventing a large array of attack techniques, you may consider configuring and deploying application control solutions like AppLocker or Windows Defender application control. It's not as hard as it may seem. I speak from a little bit of experience there. The next could be if you have Defender AV in your environment, there are some great supplemental behavioral rules in the form of attack surface reduction rules. There's nothing specific to process injection, but a lot of behavioral or weaponization specific primitives could be caught using these rules. Some more tactical mitigations that may apply a little more directly to process injection would be, there's a couple mitigations included in Windows Defender Exploit Guard, which is now included in Windows 10. One such mitigation is arbitrary code guard, which can either alert or prevent the allocation of executable pages at runtime. So that's worth investigating. Another would be export or import address table access filtering, which is not specific to process injection, but considering in many of these cases where we're referring to position independent code, where you have shellcode payloads, I would say predominantly the shellcode payloads out there reference memory in a certain way when they're trying to resolve APIs, in which case this mitigation would kick in and detect that. Now, if we're talking about an actual good mitigation against process injection, we do have one, but it is specific to LSA or the LSAS process. So there's a great resource on that. That's protected by virtualization-based security and UEFI. So once you enable that setting, my understanding is any process that doesn't have, that's not a protected process cannot get a handle to LSAS. So that's a pretty robust mitigation there. All right, so we're starting to run out of time, but I did want to leave room for, let's say, 2 questions, and we'll try to get to those quickly and then let you be on your way since we respect your time. Adam, was there anything good that came up?
So Brian was giving us the buzzer to wrap up and save the questions for a blog post.
Okay, well, we can do that as well, because yeah, Brian really does want to be respectful of everyone's time. So with that, I wanted to thank you all, Adam, Erika, David. Like, your expertise was like really great here, and it's been great working with you for this. And everyone else on the webinar, thank you so much for your time. I hope you learned something, or your existing incredible knowledge was reinforced by the material here. And yeah, we'll definitely address some of the questions in a follow-on blog post. So again, thank you, and we'll see y'all later.
Thanks, Matt.
All right.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
All right.